Hello, I'm Peter Oborne, political columnist of the Daily Mail and also of Middle East Eye. And we're here today to discuss something which perhaps not all of us know is going on, the general election. And we've got four of Britain's most brilliant political minds here to discuss this epoch-making event. And this programme is going to be divided into two sections. In the first section, we're going to give each of them an opportunity to present their case, starting with Afzal Amin, a former British soldier, and he's speaking on behalf of the Conservative interest. As a supporter of the Conservative Party, that's what he is. Afzal Amin.
Well, hello, Peter. It's great to be here. I think this election, certainly in my lifetime, is probably the most important election that we faced. The Brexit vote that was completed and we, of course, are going to leave the European Union presents unique challenges, which I think for the last few decades we've not really engaged with or faced. And as someone who supported the desire to leave the European Union, I'm very excited about the future the country faces, particularly as we engage with the rest of the world on a whole range of issues, from economics to our political reach to our relationships on a social and familial level. And I think at this very difficult time of the next 2 years, as we negotiate our exit from the European Union, we need a strong team that's going to do that. And for me, the choice is very clear. On one side, you've got a very strong team who've been in government now for the last 7 years, who are very familiar with their briefs and know exactly where the country is heading in terms of its global outlook. On the other side, you've got people who, certainly on the Labour side, who, if they came to power, would represent, I think, a very serious risk to the surety that we need as the country moves from being a part of the European Union to a country that leaves. And that's why I think Theresa May's team of people deserve our support much more than Jeremy Corbyn and what's been described as a coalition of chaos, where the other parties come together with Jeremy Corbyn to rule our country.
Tell me a little bit. We're going to give the Labour Party a chance to come back and answer some of these criticisms, but about what it matters in particular to Muslims.
Well, I think this is a great time to be British and to be Muslim. Most Muslims in this country have antecedents from the Commonwealth, and this is a great opportunity for those individuals and the corporations and businesses that they're a part of, and the societies that they're a part of, to use their family links, their historical links, their linguistic links with the Commonwealth to promote not only British business and British economic interests, but also British values, which, I mean, as someone who's travelled to more than 47 countries, I think Britain is the best place in the world in which to live. It's a great place to be a Muslim, and I think Muslims are very invested in this country in every single way except in politics. So my encouragement to the British Muslim communities is that, first of all, do understand the issues and do vote on June the 8th. It's absolutely critical. Whoever you choose to vote for, I support the fact that you should vote. And secondly, get involved with the main organism in this country of politics, which is the political parties. And then once you've chosen which party to get involved with, become a contributing member of that party's hierarchy and push your ideas forward and see what fertile ground they might find to then bring the interest that the Muslim community has into politics. And for those who can and feel able to, absolutely, people should stand at local level and at national level and be an elected official who then campaigns for the interests of the people who voted for them and their own individual ideas within the political sphere. So at this time for British Muslims, I think it's a great opportunity, and Brexit represents an opportunity to contribute on a scale that perhaps we haven't seen since the Second World War.
Murad Qureshi, you represent the Labour interest. You're a very senior Labour politician. You've just heard that Labour equals chaos. You've got your opportunity to respond.
Well, I mean, it's interesting how the Tories are adamant in trying to make this a presidential election when this is a parliamentary one. They clearly don't have much confidence in all their local candidates standing as parliamentary candidates. That set apart, I think the Muslim community have got three good reasons why they should vote Labour. Firstly, they've been adversely affected by austerity for the last 7 years. We're the only ones offering an alternative to austerity. Things like cuts to benefits, child benefits, for example, example. You won't get it for the third child, or you won't get it unless it's conceived under rape. The cuts in public services have undoubtedly affected the Muslim communities of all the varieties that we have, more so than many other communities. I think we're the only ones offering an alternative to that, because we've seen 7 years of austerity has actually increased public debts and not got the economy growing in the way that it should do. I was also struck yesterday, struck by our launch of our manifesto when Mohammed Azan was talking on behalf of the party, how he was also concerned about the future of his kids. They were going to be the graduates, and he wanted to be secure that they were going to get jobs and not be laden with debt. Again, we are addressing those issues by not having students have huge debts again, as we've had all the way through the best part of the Tories in power for the last 7 years. Islamophobia is undoubtedly an issue, and I think we've got to make inroads in showing some respect to Islam. And I think actually the work of a lot of local authorities run by Labour has shown the way on that front. Fortunately, last year in London, we saw one of the worst campaigns against Sadiq Khan, to the extent that I would suggest it was Islamophobic right from the top of the Tory party, and we've not yet heard an apology from them. I think showing some basic respect for people's faith is paramount, and the Labour Party, certainly in the last election, was going to make it an aggrieved crime, Islamophobia, and will go, no doubt, build further to that in this election in the event of being elected. And finally, certainly under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, we're an anti-war party. Jeremy has made quite clear in his recent speech at Chatham House that we don't want to bomb first, talk later. His position on things like the recent support of the Syrian attack by Trump, where it should be multilateral and have legal basis, I think is the way forward. And not actually getting ourselves in with Donald Trump to the extent that we're holding hands with him, not only physically, but in policy versus
the Prime Minister.
Yes,
famously.
indeed,
Yep.
indeed. I think she's terribly embarrassed about that still. But it just shows how close she wants to get to Trump, when I think she's deluded. We're not going to get a better trade deal by keeping close to him, because he's not even for America first. He's really for himself, and I think the American people are going to find that out. So in three respects, we're offering an alternative to austerity, respect to Islam, and finally, we're not going to get into bed with Donald Trump.
Well, let's take the opportunity very quickly. Will you apologise for what Mr. Qureshi says was an Islamophobic election campaign last year?
Well, absolutely not. I think surely in politics there is a space for ideas, and I think some of the issues that were raised by Zach Goldsmith's campaign did go too far in the attacks on Sadiq Khan, and we've seen now.
Why don't you apologise?
Because I'm not responsible for that.
Should the Conservative Party apologise?
I think that the party certainly needs a review of how they conducted themselves at that time, and I think the most telling thing was David Cameron holding Sadiq Khan's hand over the Brexit issue and lauding him for being the son of immigrants who had now become a great politician in this country.
Does it trouble you that Crosby Textor, the firm of strategists which oversaw the Conservative campaign in London last year, is in charge this time?
It doesn't trouble me at all this time, for the simple reason he lost then for Zach Goldsmith. He'll lose again this time.
Right, let's now move on to the amazing insights from the Liberal Democratic Party, and that is Elaine Bagshaw has come. It's brilliant of you to come in.
Thank you.
And you too have got your 5 minutes of glory.
So I think, first of all, in terms of coalition of chaos, that we've said very, very clearly there will be no coalition that we will enter into, and we certainly wouldn't go into one with Jeremy Corbyn post the election. The coalition that we are seeing is between the Conservatives and UKIP. So UKIP have stood down in a number of places in order to support the Tories, because the Conservatives are now taking on a number of their policies and are flying their flag for hard Brexit and leaving the European Union despite the damage that it may do to a number of communities. What the Liberal Democrats are saying in this election that's important for the people watching is on Brexit, we think you should have a say on the deal, on what comes back from the European Union at the end of 2 years. We think we started with democracy and we should finish with it as well. It shouldn't just be Theresa May and her friends in Parliament that get to decide under what terms we leave. We also want to...
And her elected representatives, or are you trying to suggest that the MPs are just chums of Theresa May?
Well, I think...
Are you attacking the electoral system? You're saying there's something wrong with it, are you?
Well, yes, as Liberal Democrats, we believe in proportional representation.
So they're all
we
just
think the whole
chums of
thing
Theresa
needs...
May. They're not MPs
They're not all
elected
just...
by the people. Right, that's an interesting perspective from
they're
the
not
Lib
all,
Dem.
They're not all just chums of Theresa May, but there are people that simply follow party whips consistently, such as my opponent in Poplar and Limehouse, who has consistently followed Jeremy Corbyn's whip. We are also talking about closing the ethnic minority pay gap. So in the same way as when we were in coalition, Jo Swinson brought in legislation so that companies had to publish the pay gap between men and women. We're saying we want to do that for the ethnic minority communities as well and expose those companies that habitually pay white middle-class people, I suppose, like myself, more money than ethnic minorities with no good reason to do so. And then we also want to reform crime and justice legislation. So we want to scrap the prevent strategy that we think has been really damaging to community relations, particularly with the Muslim community. And this comes up a lot in my constituency and in Tower Hamlets, where people think they are unnecessarily targeted. And we also want to work with BME organisations within the police force and put more funding and resource into that so that we attract more ethnic minorities into the police, rather than at the moment there are still problems with institutional racism, and there are problems with things like stop and search unnecessarily targets ethnic minorities. So we want to do things like that to target those issues.
Very interesting. What you say you want to scrap Prevent, not to review it, to scrap it.
No, we said we would scrap it and we would want to replace it with something that builds community relations rather than what it does at the moment, which
what will you be doing, Murad Qureshi?
We've actually, Andy Burnham, before he stood down, suddenly recommended that, and it's something which Diane Abbott...
To scrap
also,
it?
Yeah.
Scrap, both to scrap. So Lib Dem scrapping Prevent.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Labour is going to scrap Prevent. The Greens...
I think, yes, we would review it, and I think...
Review or scrap?
I think we're in favour of scrapping Prevent as well.
Scrap?
Yeah.
Afzal Amin for the Conservatives?
Well, I'm not. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the party, but personally, I think Prevent has been a disaster, purely when looking at the outcomes. So I think it needs a review simply to extract the good that may have come from some of the interventions. But generally speaking, I think it should be scrapped.
Right. All four parties here in this studio. At this moment, you're leaving yourself open to changing your mind, but are for scrapping Prevent. And what are the other leading policies which will affect the Muslim communities, as far as you're concerned?
So there are those issues, and then in my constituency we find that there are a lot of issues around education. So because lots of people in my constituency who are of Muslim religion have tended to be immigrants, we want to make sure that there's a really good education system. So we are against what the Conservatives are doing, which is changing the national funding formula. We've announced in our manifesto that we would triple the pupil premium. So in my constituency alone, that would give an extra £62 million to our local schools, and across the country it's an extra £7 billion worth of funding to make sure that there is that aspiration and opportunity for absolutely everyone, but particularly in areas like Tower Hamlets, where 15 years ago our schools were incredibly underfunded, children were failing, they weren't being given opportunities. It's making sure that what are now outstanding schools stay that way.
So while we're on the subject of education, your leader, Nick Clegg, he, of course, supported tuition fees. What are you going to do about them?
Our former leader, yes. So in coalition we did. So we're not committing to scrapping tuition fees anymore. No, we would keep the system as it is. We think we got the best possible system in terms of balancing that there are more people from poorer backgrounds and ethnic minority backgrounds going to university than ever before.
So it's worked. It's very... And she's saying, what about you, Murad Qureshi, that here we have a Lib Dem saying that the tuition fees were a good thing, and you helped push them through.
It's interesting how, our work with young voters certainly brings that issue up time and time again, and it's actually one of the most popular things that Jeremy and the Labour Party is offering in its manifesto to get rid of tuition fees. Young people don't want to start life with a horrendous amount of debts. It makes them very wary of then going into the housing market. as well.
You'll go on forever if I let you. It's actually the turn of the Green Party. We've got 5 minutes. Your time starts now.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
So everyone knows the Green Party really has a foundational philosophy that's quite different from the other mainstream parties. So, we really believe we put the environment at the heart of our policies, and also community and people. And from there, we make policies from that position. I agree with you. I think that this is one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And I think what we need in this country is direction. We need politicians with brave visions who can see what the potential is for the future and how we can support communities, particularly local communities, to have a say in the direction of their lives and have a say in their lives. So particularly for the Green Party, we are very much in favour of local democracy, for the PR, for proportional representation. At the moment we have a political system that favours two parties, and we don't have two parties, we have more than that. And I think that it's important that people are able to vote for the parties that they want to and vote on the issues that they want to vote on. And for a great many people, this might be the environment. I think in the coming years, these are some of the challenges that all of us face. And I think these issues need to be incorporated into our day-to-day decisions about policies, and that includes all policies on education, community, policing, and all issues.
So right, you're making a policing decision. The environment, where does that come into this decision on whether or not to have more policemen, say?
Well, eventually, the environment has an impact on resources availability, which eventually down the road is going to have an effect on conflict.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's follow your logic through. Well, we'll make the decision to have. All of us, everybody wants more policemen. I think we can say that. And you're saying that the environment has a bearing on that. Will you take a sacrificial measure, i.e., a measure which will put up the price of fuel and damage the economy in the interest of the environment?
So I think I don't want to caricaturise my position because...
No, I'm asking you a question. I want to caricaturise your position.
All right.
I'm sorry about that, but that's how it works in the studio.
Peter, that's your job, but that's fine. No, that's fine. I mean, as I said, the environment is the heart of our policies, but we have other things like social justice.
No, I'm just asking you a question. Would you take a decision which favoured the environment, but was bad for the economy?
I don't think it is either or. I think our economy is dependent on our natural resources, and I think protecting our natural resources and protecting our environment equals wealth. And so I don't think there is. I don't agree that dichotomy exists. And I think in the longer term, in terms of health, we see we've got a massive issue with air pollution in this city, all over this country. And actually, we need to do something about that. And I mean, and I'm not actually obviously from Tower Hamlets, but I've massive inequality in terms of health outcomes.
I apologise for this, but we're coming to the end of this first half of this programme. The second half, believe you me, is going to enlighten us even more. It's going to tell us the truth about the great issues which face us as a nation in 2017. In the second half of this programme, we're going to discuss the burning issues of the general election as they impact on the ethnic minorities and on Muslims. And to kick us off, we've got a new contestant, a Deus Ex Machina arrival, Dr. Zubaida Haque, a genius, an intellect beyond imagination, several hundred points of IQ from the Runnymede Trust, and she is going to explain the issues in 3 minutes.
Well, I'm here because essentially we're talking about Muslims, but also Muslims in the context of ethnic minorities. And what's really interesting about ethnic minorities in these elections is for the first several weeks they weren't even spoken about. And yet there's about 3 million ethnic minorities who are going to be voting in this election. And what's particularly interesting about them is, first of all, their sheer size. They've doubled since 1991, but also they've spread out across many, many, many more areas now. And what that means in this election is that their votes will count more than ever before. The problem is, though, their votes are not predictable. They used to be predictable. So back in the early 1980s and the early 1990s, about 90% of ethnic minorities and Muslims voted for Labour. But basically what's been happening since 2010, 2015, in those elections, is that vote has dwindled.
Surely that was the 2005 election when the Muslims abandoned Labour.
Well, yes, I mean, and there was definitely a penalty. You're absolutely right, Peter. There was definitely a penalty.
Iraq War, yes.
Absolutely,
and
there has been a
Lib Dems
fallout
over there.
And then there's definitely been a fallout. But they didn't penalise Labour. They penalised Labour a little bit, and Lib Dems were certainly the beneficiaries of that punishment. But they have been pretty loyal. I mean, so their voters dwindled, but they've been pretty loyal. But the most important aspect to understand, I think, is even amongst Muslims, they're not a monolithic group. So even amongst Muslims, different ethnic groups, different classes and different regions are voting differently. And I think that's where the Conservatives have got a bit more savvy, and they've been managing to pick up the BME votes.
How interesting, because I got the impression that the Conservatives didn't care much about Muslims.
Well, isn't that interesting? I think in some ways, I think the Muslim constituents have picked that up. And of course, the Conservatives have a legacy. I mean, it's really interesting. I was listening to the first part of this show where you were all talking about manifestos, and I found myself thinking, you don't start off with a blank slate. You know, voters don't just look at you in terms of future promises. They also look at you in terms of historical legacies. And you're absolutely right, Peter, to say that voters will be looking at the Conservative Party and asking themselves the question of, will the Conservative parties meet my needs, not just as a British voter, but as a Muslim voter? And I think that's where there's definitely a mixed record.
Do you agree with that, Afzal Amin? You stood as a candidate. What do you think about the Conservative commitment to the Muslim vote?
I don't think any party should favour any particular faith group, for a start. And I think Muslims in particular, I'm a Muslim myself. I've spent several years studying to be an imam and to really understand the religion, speak Arabic like I speak English and so on. So I have a good grasp of the Muslim communities across the UK through various lectures and talks that I do. And I think the overwhelming issue is how competent is the party to run the country. And I'll pick up just one very quick point on education. In Birmingham, where I live, 20,500 students last year applied for grammar schools for only 3,000 places, showing that the electorate wants grammar schools. But the Labour Party is completely opposed. Number 2 on their manifesto is an opposition to all new grammar schools. So we've got to put ideologies to one side, and a degree of history, I think, needs to be examined. But really, let's look to the future.
No, I'm sorry, Afzal, but that's very selective evidence. I mean, you pick one poll, and we all know polls.
I didn't mention a poll.
Sorry, you make about that the voters want grammar schools. Actually, what the voters want are good state schools. And I think if you had a poll where you asked the voter questions in that order, and order really matters in surveys. If you ask them, do you want good state schools? Do you want funding to go into good state schools, or do you want grammar schools? Then I think you'll find a very different preferential choices there.
I don't disagree with that. But on this this issue of what parents are actually applying for today in Birmingham. 20,000 students every year are applying for grammar schools. And the Conservatives want to deliver grammar schools because across the country, grammar schools have shown consistently to have better educational outcomes than many of the state schools. And this is something which is critically important.
Why not support better funding for state schools?
Absolutely.
That's what this government is responsible for. We've seen the biggest cuts in.
But throwing more money at failing institutions isn't the answer.
But lots of them aren't.
I was going to say,
many aren't. That's true.
You're about to take £800 per pupil at least out of schools in Tower Hamlets, and these are schools that have outstanding Ofsted ratings and 15 years ago were failing. We don't need grammar schools or free schools or any other of this tinkering of our education system in our areas. We need good schools. The reason that grammar schools in Birmingham are oversubscribed is because that the other schools are not seen as being as good. Yes. And actually, most parents just want a good school down the road that they can send their child to. They will be safe, they will get a good education, and that's it. There doesn't need to be all of this segregation of the education system that there is, and there definitely doesn't need to be the Conservative cuts to education that we're seeing.
Sure, but 18 years of Labour and then a Birmingham Council controlled by Labour has not delivered for exactly the people you're talking about.
But the reality about the funding, though, is that actually the funding for free schools and grammar schools has been ring-fenced at the expense of every other school in those neighbourhoods. You've lost the plot.
It's not just about funding. This is my point. It's about greater issues.
Well, can I just say that
Please.
actually, if you look at the fee-paying schools, Eton's and what have you, your parents are paying 40-odd thousand. I dare say that the quality of the education they're offering is reflection of that, and it's the same with the state system.
Have you visited Eton College?
If the state system had similar amounts of money, I dare say it would be on par with it.
So I've got a limited amount of time, and I know, but thank you. That showed you the passions this election is going to release. Let's have a look at foreign policy, where there is such a marked difference between the various parties. What is your position in the Greens?
We take a position that is about prevention. So again, we're not about starting wars and asking questions later. We're most definitely against the war in Iraq and unnecessary foreign interventions. I think there's
You're
a lot.
in favour of necessary ones. That's interesting.
Well,
what about you? You're Mr. Qureshi, you'll Stop the War Coalition, not your chairman of it. He doesn't like wars at all.
Well, that's strictly not true. But the reality is, whilst we've got Jeremy as leader of the Labour Party, I think we're going to move in a direction away from bomb first and talk later.
Let's have a look at one case in point, right? And let's see where we all stand. Yemen. Now, at the moment, we have a situation where the unfortunate Yemeni people are being bombed by a Saudi-led coalition, backed by the Brits. Now, should Britain take stronger steps? Let's go one by one. Very quick answer. Stronger steps to stop supplying arms to the Yemenis, perhaps, in order to send a message. Sorry, arms to the Saudis, I should say, in order to send a message to the Saudis.
Yes, absolutely. I think we should. I don't think we should be entering into any new arms deals with them as long as...
No more arms deals with the Saudis.
No more arms deal and humanitarian assistance to the Yemenis. They've got famine around the corner. It's going to hit them any matter of time.
Absolutely. Stop the sales to arms.
All right, no more arms.
What this needs is a United Nations intervention in Yemen.
Intervention in
absolutely,
Yemen.
and because civilians are dying in the thousands, 20 million people are starving.
What do you mean by United Nations intervention?
We
fact-finding mission?
No, we should see a military intervention, which the United Nations is designed for, not against whom, in support of the Yemeni people, so that the bombing can stop. Because at the moment, the regional powers, Saudi Arabia on one side, Iran on the other, have legitimate concerns about where Yemen is going, and they're exercising that.
The United Nations-led intervention. I'd like to explore it more. But
can I just say, can I just shift the debate a little? Because there's an assumption here that Muslim voters will put foreign policy very high on their agenda. But actually, we forget that they're British Muslim voters. So absolutely, foreign policy matters. I think we've seen that.
It's the first time we've raised foreign policy in this programme.
Yes,
it's an hour-long one.
I understand. But what I'm trying to say is, going back to the fact that this is a British election, British Muslims will be looking at the historical legacies in the party, and that will be very important. We've mentioned Prevent. Prevent is very important because at the moment the Conservatives have sort of transformed Prevent so that GPs and teachers are everyday border agents, and that's an issue for Muslims.
Not one of you has defended Prevent, but a lot of people watching this will say, hang on, there is a purpose to Prevent. There is a genuine terrorist
There's a
threat.
counter-terrorism purpose, but the problem is that Muslims are conflated with counter-terrorism. The integration of Muslims is conflated with counter-terrorism. And
But
I think what
lots of
Muslims
British people will
what Muslims-
say, including Muslims, that there is a link between Islamist ideology and violent attacks.
There's also a link within, in terms of a very small proportion, an extremely small proportion of Muslims being Islamist extremists. But that doesn't mean that all Muslims are Islamist extremists.
That's why
so
I was
we have to be
interested.
careful
I
of
don't think anybody
correlations
is
here.
saying that all Muslims. And that's just setting up a straw man. Nobody, not even the most fanatical neocon, thinks that all Muslims are. And so let's have a sensible discussion, not with straw men which don't exist. But do you accept that there is a terrorist threat in this country?
Like most countries, yes. I
Do
think
you
we're vulnerable.
accept that there is a link to Islamist ideology in some of those terrorist attacks?
There's a jihadist link.
Yes, and I was
Jihadi-
thinking we've
and
got a lot
is
of
it not
lone-
responsible, therefore, to have a strategy which identifies people who are likely to commit terrorist
Except
attacks?
look at the history of attacks. I mean, the recent Westminster attack was a lone wolf. I mean, the nature of attacks have changed. Of course, we've felt exposed since 2001. Absolutely, I can see that. And recently, you know, I was in the States, and you can see that they're prepped for another attack. But of course, I'm sure if you talk to MI5 and MI6, the nature of the nature of terrorism has changed, so that it's more and more individuals. We've seen that in France, we've seen that in Germany.
Nevertheless,
so in that sense,
it is the
in that-
responsibility. There is no more serious responsibility of the state than to protect its own citizens.
Absolutely.
Now, whether they're lone wolf attacks or sort of conspiracies, either way. Do you accept there is a need for the Prevent strategy, even if they've got it wrong?
The core problem is, if I just interject, the core problem is of modelling. In the early days, Prevent looked at the few people who became terrorists and then extrapolated their ideas onto the rest of the Muslim community. Actually, what should have happened and what needs to happen is let's look at what inoculates the 3 million British Muslims from becoming terrorists and use that to then de-radicalise and counter those who are actually terrorists. And the numbers are absolutely tiny. I mean, we're talking 15 to 20 people out of 3 million.
He's a former army officer, and he knows he's had high level experience. Let's move on to Islamophobia. Is this a problem which will come to you last again? Because he represents the ruling party. Is this a problem which has not been addressed well enough by British government?
Well, on the jobs front, clearly, that's something that needs to be addressed. What can be worse than actually being told you've got to get all the you need all these qualifications to get jobs, and you get them all and have the highest marks and what have you, and then find in the job market you have a much more difficult barrier to get through, which is your name and dare I say, your appearance, potentially. That needs to be dealt with, I think.
So you're saying there is very serious discrimination.
Well, the evidence is there. Now, I
Yes.
personally haven't come across that, but the evidence is clearly there in academic circles, and I do think governments of the day need to address that. And I think even Theresa May has put out something that she wants to do on that front. So there is some acknowledgement across the political divide.
Very briefly, what are the facts?
Well, the facts are academic studies actually and DW and the Department of Work and Pensions have shown that there is discrimination in the employment market for ethnic minorities, but also for Muslims in particular. So you can actually separate Muslims from the ethnic groups and see that there is a Muslim penalty in the labour market. And it gets even more complicated than that, because not only is there a Muslim penalty where, for instance, they're more likely to be unemployed, twice the proportion of Muslims are unemployed compared to the white British population. They're more likely to be on low pay, and they're more likely to have and low pay. So there's that evidence, but there's also a double penalty for particular ethnic groups amongst Muslims. So one of the most underappreciated stories, if you like, is around black Muslims in the labour market. We rarely talk about it. Most of government policy has been around Muslims, and of course they focus disproportionately on Bangladeshis and Pakistanis around employment disparities. But black Muslims are
Somalians,
overlooked.
for
No,
instance.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Black Muslims are overlooked time and time again. Of course, they're overlooked throughout
Because
the
we've
system.
got what is the Green Party policy on these very serious discriminatory issues?
Well, we'd like to see.
And you've come from Brent,
Yes.
fighting Brent, so
yeah,
you see
which
a
is
lot
one of the
it,
most.
I
Well,
expect,
yeah, I was going to say, which is one of the most multicultural constituencies in the UK. I think what we'd like to see is reinstating of a Human Rights and Equalities Commission, which can overview and look into the jobs market. But also, I mean, I think also what needs to be looked at is the way in which language in the media has been sanctioned and the way that we talk about Muslims. And I think that has had a massive effect in the way perceptions have been shaped about Muslims and the way that they have been othered in people's minds. And I think that those things are really difficult to break down. And I think we would really like to see more investment in communities. What the issue with Prevent is it's reactive. It's a reactive strategy. We've highlighted a problem and we're reacting against it. And so the Green Party position is about prevention. It's about working with communities.
Well,
like
so
you said,
Prevent, that's about prevention, that's what it calls itself.
But Shafa's
It's
absolutely right.
discriminatory.
You're absolutely right to talk about the othering of Muslim communities, because since 2001, that's slowly but steadily happening, and now it's overt with the populists, white nationalists. It's an overt othering.
Well, hang on. You say with the all right. These disgusting far-right parties use that language.
Actually, but it's not just discovered. It's not just
seeping into the
discovered. It's
mainstream.
seeping into the mainstream. So even recently, Michael Gove, when he was talking about the Conservative Party and their immigration strategy, was using similar terms to Marine Le Pen. So you can see that slowly seeping. Actually, it's not even slowly. It's relatively overt. And I think for Muslim voters, they will pick up on that.
There's a very important thing we're just hearing there, and I wonder if the Lib Dems agree with this, that you're having far-right discourse, this is your allegation, entering the mainstream language at Westminster.
Definitely, I think we are around, not just around Muslims, immigration in general, but we've seen it hugely in the refugee crisis. So all of the awful stories when we were accepting children refugees, and then there was awful language used in the media about terms like we're being swamped, accusations that they weren't actually children and we should be examining their teeth to make sure that they definitely were, and these are people that are fleeing conflict.
Well, hang on, I saw some of these pictures. They clearly weren't children. So, I mean, how do you answer that? I mean, they weren't. I mean, is it
There's
something...
always exceptions. There's always exceptions. And if we design policies by exceptions, we wouldn't get very far. I worked for government for almost 15 years. You don't design policies by exceptions. You design policies by the average.
You don't do it by denial either.
Well, the thing is why would you even talk about as soon as you start saying yes, there is the odd child that may be, there is the odd child refugee that may be over 16, it becomes the story. You're a journalist, you know it becomes the story. So it's one thing to say in private
for the
we have
massive
these
British
issues.
people, how do you answer this?
But I think this is also an example of how the public debate has been poisoned, because actually instead of actually talking about why aren't we accepting our fair share of refugees? Why are we not helping people who are vulnerable? We now have a situation where we're discussing who's deserving or not, and it seems that section of people who are deserving is very small. So we say that we are allowed children, but we're not even allowed to discuss
And
why
it's a
aren't we allowing
shifting
adults?
of the narrative. It's a deliberate shifting of the debate. And I think going back to the British Muslim voter, I think the one thing I was trying to get across in my article is voters are not stupid. That they're picking up these discussions. They can see the narrative shifting. So as much as the Conservative Party is trying to say, no, we're starting off a new slate. Actually, we're going to look at pay gaps, racial pay gaps, just a few days, but a few weeks before the elections. I think the voter will be looking at the historical legacies of the party. Labour Party, for instance, are the only party that have introduced anti-discrimination legislation. The Conservatives haven't introduced any
very
anti-discrimination
briefly, Afzal
legislation.
Amin, let's get your take on this. I mean, the Tory party is much stronger on immigration. So rephrase it, has tougher policies on immigration, anti-immigration policies, than Labour, and particularly refugees. Where do you stand on this? Do you feel that we should, as I think everybody around here wants to do, let in plenty of refugees, a fair, or you'd say a fair, or would you say there ought to be restrictions?
I mean, the last 5,000 years history of this country, these British Isles, is a history of refugees. And certainly after the Second World War, the refugees that came here, settled here, and have become a functioning part of this country. And then the migrant workers who came here, like my own parents in the 50s and 60s, have now settled and are part of this country. And those waves will continue for the next 5,000 years. So certainly where people are displaced by war, and the Syria war is a brilliant example of that, our failure to intervene and prevent that slaughter has resulted in this huge refugee flow.
We
should have intervened early on. We can still intervene, and I believe that Bashar al-Assad should be taken to The Hague as a war criminal, alongside Tony Blair as a matter of point.
What are the chances of that happening, Afzal?
Okay,
What's happening since... I'm sorry, I know I've butted in, but what I find really interesting is since the local elections, we're now being told by many of the survey companies like YouGov and so on, that potentially 2 million UKIP voters are going to be absorbed into the Conservative Party.
That's
now, these 2
untrue.
million, OK, let's say it's optimistic, let's say it's 1.9.
Well, it's not at all. No one from UKIP is going to be absorbed into the party.
These 2 million that are going to be absorbed by the Labour Party, they're not voters that are coming, they're not sheep that are coming back into the fold. They are bringing with them the baggage of the UKIP voter. Now, of course, UKIP voter is much like BME voters. There's all sorts of heterogeneity there. But at the same time, polls have shown that UKIP voters have much more right-wing much more sort of right-wing policies. They're much more leaning towards the right. They have very strong policies around immigration and around immigration and immigrants. How will how will you balance that with Muslim voters?
Sure, there's a racist framing here which you've succumbed to. Immigration does not equal a particular racial group. Immigration from the European Union has been a huge problem.
You've got 1.5 minutes to go, and in those 1.5 minutes, I'm going to go around each of you and going to predict the result on June the 8th, and we'll start with the how many Lib Dem seats will we be looking at?
I think we'll double the number of seats that we'll get. I think the story of the night is going to be the collapse of the Labour Party, and this question of whether or not there is a new party that forms is based on they won't have a lot of moderates left.
I think we're making better inroads than people realise on the ground. I won't be surprised if we have much the same figures, quite honestly, as we had 2 years ago. And in that respect, that would be actually quite a victory for Jeremy.
No collapse. A collapse of the Labour Party means... What about the Greens? How do you see it from the Green perspective?
Well, I mean, we've obviously got one seat. We're hoping to get a few more seats. There's at least 3 other seats that we are eyeing up, and hopefully we can see more Greens in Parliament. I sincerely hope that we don't see a collapse in the Labour vote, because I think we need a real opposition through them, and I'm hoping for the best, preparing for the worst.
No, the Tory party inflicted this election on us.
It's a great opportunity.
How many? How many Tory seats will we?
Britain's going to choose the strong and stable leadership of Theresa May, and we're going to see, I think, a significantly increased majority, which I think is going to be in treble figures.
Cliche, doesn't he?
I only used it once today, and I was keen to get it in. It's that or the coalition of chaos.
So how many Tory seats?
I think we're going to see a triple-figure increase in the majority.
Triple-figure increase, more than 100 plus. Now here we come, as the boffin, the genius, Zubaydah Haque, knows everything.
I think I agree with most of us around the table. I think, I mean, obviously Theresa May inflicted this election because she knew that she would win. So I don't think that's where the story is. But I think Murad's right that we may find that although the Labour Party will get a lot fewer votes than they did 2 years ago, at the same time, I think voters will realise that we need a strong opposition. The strong opposition with all due respect to Lib Dems and Greens, will be Labour in that sense, just in terms of sheer numbers. But at the same time,
Because of the nature of our
at the same time, we can see a coalition as
She
well.
won't let me finish. But I defer to her. What a discussion! How amazing! Great issues raised, and 3 weeks to go.